Amazing. Hello, everyone. Hi. We are here in a new session of Educar con Sentido with Ezequiel Passeron. Today we have the possibility to talk with Luci Pangrazio. She is a lecturer in Deakin University in Australia. We will talk with her about the situation in Australia, her situation in this last year, and of course about one of the most important fields that where she's working now and the last year also is data literacy. So hello, Luci, how are you? Thank you very much for accepting to be part of this experience, Educar con Sentido experience. And initially, I would like to know, how are you and how you lived the last year? Not only you, of course, also you know, you and your family, but how was your experience in the university and how is the situation in Australia in general?
Sure. Thanks for having me. I'm good, actually. I've just returned from summer holiday and we've had the university closed just before Christmas. Given the difficulty of 2020, we had a sort of extended break, and it was actually great because in Victoria, which is the state where I'm from, we had a very difficult lockdown that went for, it felt like schools were closed for, I think, between 6 to 7 months. But we emerged from the lockdown in about October, and since then the schools have opened up. And in Victoria, we had almost 2 months of no new community cases. So I have one son and he went back to school. So that was good because we felt like we could start to do some work again. And we had that sort of sense of normality return. So we've had a pretty normal Christmas. I know that's probably hard to hear from other parts of the world because I know things are very difficult. But Christmas was pretty normal. There were restrictions on numbers, and we've had a couple of outbreaks in New South Wales. And now, most of the cases now that are in Victoria are in quarantine. They've come from overseas for the Australian Open. So that's the kind of level of virus in the community. It's being managed pretty well. It's mainly from international travellers. So we're on the long summer break in schools now. So they go back in January, and I think that we have things under control to the state where if there was an outbreak, I don't think they'd close schools down because they realise how difficult that is for the economy and for families. So I think after last year, we're pretty good, and we feel like our hard work during the year has paid off because we have kind of got the numbers so low. That said, of course, it's never really over. But yeah, no, we're doing pretty well.
Okay, Luci, I wanted to ask you first, how do you see that the schools have been facing the challenge of online education, but also you have been researching for a long time on data literacy and the generation of data. So we want to ask you a little bit general first, how this would impact in your area of research after or while we're living the pandemic, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think here in Australia, we consider ourselves to be, a pretty wealthy country, really. But the pandemic showed up a lot of the deficiencies in our digital infrastructure in schools. There are a lot of schools, including the school that, my son went to, where students, didn't have access to devices. So remote learning was really difficult. And internet coverage, across Australia is really patchy in parts. So, in the major cities, it's fine. But as soon as you get out of those centres, you have great problems. So I think that the pandemic, like many other parts of the world, really showed up all those problems for us. And, there were articles in the paper around teachers having to drive, printed out copies of things to students because they had no other way of learning. And, our teachers have just done such an amazing job and really supported the students to ensure that everyone has those equal opportunities, like going above and beyond. I think as far as, my own research area, it's been obviously very interesting, and many students have really had a crash course in digital literacy, particularly like if you think about pre-teens, which some of my most recent work has been with pre-teens. They've all of a sudden had to learn how to use, multiple platforms and, I guess understand the nuances of those platforms, as well as get their head around things, to do with terms and conditions and privacy. And in Australia, we don't really have any overriding body that kind of regulates the apps and platforms in schools. It's kind of up to individual schools to do it. Yeah. So again, you see great disparity across different schools. And there's this interesting kind of organisation started up a couple of years ago that were attached to the Victorian Department of Education. They were actually going to start trying to regulate all the apps and digital platforms in schools and like vetting them, checking that they were appropriate for the students and teachers to use. And they got started, but then realised that there was just such an overwhelming array of apps and platforms already existing in schools that they were just overrun and they couldn't keep up. So they actually folded. So there's no overriding body to kind of help schools through, what's a good app, what are the fine details in the terms and conditions. And, that's a big job for teachers and administrators in schools to get their head around, as well as, just the challenges of online learning. So again, there are always kind of problems that exist in the background, but they've really come to the fore in the last kind of couple of years. So I think, people have been forced to improve their digital literacy and data literacy, but obviously there's a whole lot more that needs to be done in that space as well.
Okay, interesting. It's a general question also, but I would like to ask you about some of the paper that published last year with Septon Green, the social utility of data literacy, because we know that a lot of critical perspective, a lot of people that work about the critical perspective about the use of data literacy and the risk that where this data is controlled for the big text, for example. But this paper is interesting because you and Julian proposed some possibility to social utility of this data. Can you talk about the possibility of this scenario?
Yeah, so in that article, we really wanted to test out whether the kind of literacy paradigm works for data. And this, like my work, my most recent project, I'll talk a little bit later on, is really trying to work out what the text is when it comes to data, because my background is in literacies, and when we're talking about other forms of digital literacy or obviously traditional literacy, the text is very clear. We're talking about a book or a movie, the text is there. But I think when we come to talking about data, the text is so difficult to actually define. And, are we really talking about a literacy or is it a numeracy? Much of what happens with data is beyond the purview of the end user. So what we were really trying to do in that paper is test out whether the paradigm of literacies actually works for data. And in the end, we kind of decide that it does, but it's not necessarily because it's a wonderful fit, but because there's nothing better that really kind of speaks to both the kind of critical, but also the kind of everyday understandings that people need to use digital platforms. So, or, anything digital really. So we kind of, that's the kind of conclusion that we come to. And I think my current project is trying to work out how we can actually materialize a text of data in a sense that people can understand, because it is essentially behind the screen and very difficult for people to kind of get their heads around what we're even talking about, long strings of numbers or so. Yeah.
Lucy, I have a question just to know. We always talk with Pablo and also with Raquel that this thing about data, maybe it's something about what you just answered, but how to talk with kids and with youth about these themes, right? How to increase awareness. Do you know any initiative in Australia, maybe the government, or maybe is it the schools that need to talk about these things with students?
I think it is, but I don't think schools are properly prepared for the challenge of it. I mean, there's only really one place where all students go and learn in an equal way, and that is school, you know. So it makes sense that this kind of curriculum should happen in a school, because all kids will have that kind of learning. But at the same time, you know, data literacy requires quite specialist understandings. And the work that we've done with teachers has shown that really it's very difficult to pick up a lot of these concepts and for them to feel confident enough to teach that to students. So I think there's some really important work needs to happen with teachers to kind of bring them along and learn from them what they already know about data and, you know, digital practices, and try to work with them on building a kind of curriculum that will actually work in their local context. Because that's the other issue that we have, is that, you know, often programs come from somewhere else, and they end up being, you know, forced upon people. They're unhappy, you know, they don't know the content, or they don't feel strongly about it. And then, of course, you end up, you know, it fails inevitably. So what I've been working on the last couple of projects, we called it Data Smart Kids, was building this app, this chat app that really worked to kind of materialize the data. And the thing that worked most effectively with kids was to show them their geolocational data, which we could do through this particular chat app. So we could show on a map where they'd been for the last, and you know, if they'd had the app for a week, it would show all the different places that they'd been. And that was a real wow moment, you know, because they kind of, when you can tell somebody, oh, you know, you're being tracked, but until you actually see, you know, on your phone, on this dashboard that we created, you were at, you know, McDonald's at 11:59 a.m. on Tuesday, they're like, oh, all of a sudden, you know, they understand the kind of detail that they're being tracked in. And that was a great motivator. As far as, you know, apart from my own work, there's some eSmart, sort of eSafety type cyber safety stuff that happens in Australia. That's definitely the main discourse around digital learning here. And I guess part of my work has been trying to push back a little about that and move beyond it, because it tends to be very risk averse. And we know, you know, in today's world, kids need to understand how to use platforms. They need to be supported to kind of be critical and take risks. And cyber safety doesn't necessarily tend to do that. It's about, you know, being super careful. And some of the schools that I've worked with have had police come in, for example, and tell kids about what they should and shouldn't be doing. So, yeah.
No, it's interesting that the case you told us, because I think that from a pedagogical and a didactic approach, you're including kids in that exercise, and it's something practice, and maybe it also it also solves the problem that maybe teachers doesn't feel that confident to make a theoretical class of that thing, and maybe open the game and just including kids and youth in their understanding of the thing and showing data. I also think that it's a great strategy, right?
Yeah, that's true. I think it's really important to include them, because only they know what their everyday practices are. And, you know, a project I did with Julian Sefton Green a couple of years ago, we worked with teachers just to help them start researching what the kids in their class were actually doing at home. And many of them had never even kind of thought about that before. And they were really surprised by what their kids were doing, and, you know, actually the level of expertise that many of them had, the kind of advanced sort of things they were doing. And then they could bring that into the classroom and form that bridge that we're always sort of talking about, you know, trying to bridge the homeschool. You know, it's something pretty simple, but including kids, talking to them about what they're doing. It seems, you know, it's actually not done that often, which is quite surprising.
Lucy, we know that you have good information and you know different reality. I think that you work in, I don't know, and still working, but we know that you work in Uruguay with people from Chile, different people in Europe and Australia. And I would like to know, or we would like to know, what is your perception about the possibility to improve the data literacy in the academic community? For example, here in Spain, we have the tendency to introduce, for example, process of data literacy in the school community, not only, for example, keep this phenomenon in the debate in the academic world, you know, so introduce this in the process of teaching and training from the teacher, but also, for example, the family, with the kids, with the management and the policy maker and education policies also, because always we identify phenomena where the impact of the use of the data from big tech or different companies is always more strong than the capacity of the society to have the control or the understand the consequence of this. Do you think how, from your experience, the data literacy competence in the educational community?
Yeah. Oh, so are you sort of talking about the community that surrounds a school and universities as well, or?
It's linked. The problem is what the teacher don't have in the university. You know, the curriculum doesn't include this data literacy, for example, program. So when they work in the school and the practice doesn't include a critical perspective of the use of the data, because we know that they don't have the competence to understand the magnitude of the phenomenon, you know?
Yeah.
So how we can improve this? Because we understand that both are connected. I don't know if you are okay with this perception.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think, you know, as I said before, I think programs to support teachers to do this work in schools is lacking, certainly in Australia. And one thing, because I'm in a research centre that is connected to the School of Education at Deakin, and we've been trying to kind of work with pre-service teachers because we think that's probably the spot to hit. You know, I mean, teachers that are already in schools are so flat out, and unless they have time release and support to actually come and, you know, do professional development around this topic, it's just not going to happen. So we've sort of thought that pre-service teachers would actually be a great group of people to work with to kind of, I guess, mark this as an issue that needs to be dealt with. But I'm writing a paper actually with Neil at the moment, and we're kind of trying to work out what needs to happen in order to get teachers and schools to really care about this as an issue, because there's so many other things, as you well know, that schools have to do, you know, as part of, you know, all the different curriculum, you know, testing, etc. And we're sort of weighing up, you know, do you have to have it kind of mandated from a central educational kind of organisation that schools must teach this in order for us to kind of get the motivation and the time and resourcing to do this work in schools? Because otherwise it just becomes, you know, has the teacher got a personal kind of preference or interest in this subject? So aside from being able to change the Department of Education to kind of put this on as a, you know, as a really important thing that students and teachers should be learning about, we've thought that pre-service teachers would be really great to work with if we could get some kind of short program in the university that just kind of skills them up. Because I think that in the mainstream, people are becoming far more aware of data issues, you know, and I think people are becoming quite skeptical, particularly with fake news and deep fakes and, you know, all the stuff that's going on social media, mis and disinformation. there is a kind of growing sense that we need to do something about it. But I guess the next question is, well, how do we then skill up people to support students and others to learn about it? I think that's the critical step that's missing, because what we've found is that people do have an awareness and they are concerned, but then because there are no alternatives for them, or they don't have the skills, the kind of technological expertise to do much with it, they end up getting very, I guess, disheartened, feeling disempowered, and that's not good either. So, you know, as well as kind of educational programs, there needs to be some alternative kind of, you know, tech that people can use so they can see that they have a choice and that they're not locked into different, you know, this particular platform or tool or whatever it might be. So yeah, I think there's, rather than it being one magic silver bullet that's going to solve the problem, I think there's a whole lot of little things that need to happen, you know. Yeah. Perhaps a bit more emphasis from educational kind of bureaucrats around it, perhaps more emphasis pre-service teachers, and perhaps some more funding in schools, and, you know, that being kind of flagged as an issue to kind of take that mainstream concern and really do something with it.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying, Lucy. I was going to ask you something about the relationship in Australia of people with data in this last year, you know, when we increase a lot the relationship we have with digital media, but also with information itself, right? It seems to be like a paradise for all the theories of McLuhan nowadays, right? Where we are just seeing how our identity and also our relationship with others are being just mediatized by digital tools. But specifically, how do you see in Australia that people are facing with a lot of fake news? If you have a lot of misinformation and also campaigns of fake news, as I said before, and how do you see that the common media, the common media communication are facing also this challenge?
Well, I haven't. There's some really great kind of initiatives happening in New South Wales, and actually, I don't think it's Queensland, where they're starting to investigate young people's, you know, understandings of news online and how they kind of source their news and what critical practices they bring to that. And I think that investigation is underway. As far as the work that's currently happening in schools, I think, again, it's kind of like the data stuff. If the teacher is interested in it, then they might do, you know, some work on credibility online, or, you know, trying to pick if something is fake, or you know, checking the credibility of that person. But it's very dependent on the school, and also dependent on the state. So 2 years ago, I did a project that tried to kind of look at building year sevens, which are our like 12 to 13-year-olds, understandings of like fake news and like a critical kind of social media literacies, if you like. And the kids loved it because they could really apply it to what was happening online. And the teachers also really enjoyed it because we worked with them and they were able to bring some of their own content in. But it hasn't really gone much further than that because, you know, these things cost money and time and stuff. So I think there's some good work that can be done, but it seems to be quite you know, sporadic, if you like. I think in the main, people are becoming more aware of these issues, you know, like adults and kids alike. But again, without that kind of, I guess, a more critical, deeper reading and, you know, what can I do instead, or what are the alternatives, you end up with this kind of that sense of powerlessness that I was talking about before, and also a sense of anxiety as well, because, you know, one refrain I've heard a lot from teachers and students is, oh, I'm just going to give up social media altogether because, you know, it's too hard, throw your hands in the air type of thing. And I think that's because perhaps there is a real hole, there's a gap there in understanding and finding a way through it. It's just too difficult. So there's a lot of work to do.
Lucy, I would like to ask you another big question, but only I would like to ask you about the possibility to give us some highlights ideas, no completely, because it was interesting. I checked it a minute ago, the last paper that you published last week with Gillian Septon Green in Journal of New Approaches in Educational Research, and especially was coordinated with from Williamson and Castañeda. And the title of the article is very interesting. It's Digital Right, Digital Citizenship, and Digital Literacy. What is the difference? So I would like to ask you, I know what we need to read the paper, but can you give me some big idea about the difference of these three very important ideas: digital right, digital citizenship, and digital literacy? What is the difference for you?
Yeah, so Julie and I wrote this paper because I think it's something that we kind of grappled with ourselves as researchers of the digital, and, you know, what are the kind of constructs that people have to make sense of it? And they're the three ones that we kind of came up. And in fact, we actually toyed a bit with agency as well, but then decided that there wasn't really enough of, you know, formal kind of educational research around digital agency on its own. But we do talk about that in the article. So really, we just tried to disentangle them and find parts where they overlap. And what we really came up with was that, you know, digital rights, I guess, are really something that comes from the top down, essentially. They're something that, you know, a particular state or nation will decide that, you know, we have access to, and we all have digital rights. And I guess there's that kind of playoff between them being collectively and individually exercised. Obviously, it comes down to the individual to exercise them, but in a sense that they are a kind of collective digital right as well. Digital literacies, which is my main field of interest, we found when we started to try and work out what the differences are, we sort of thought that was the most individualized of the three in a way. It's about the individual kind of learning to use technologies creatively and critically. And then citizenship, we started to think about as being a part of a particular group. So in a sense, it's citizenship kind of is about signaling to the individual that you're part of a collective, whether that is, you know, an online group, an affinity group of some sort, or even, you know, is an Australian or, you know, part of a nation state, if you like. So we kind of then started to think, well, in a way, you need digital literacies as a plank to enact your rights and also to kind of think of yourself as a citizen. So we sort of come to the idea that digital literacies, in a sense, is foundational to the other three. But I guess the other reason that we really wrote the piece was that to try to find points where these three concepts could work together, because what we find is that the digital citizenship tends to belong to kind of political science. Digital literacies may be education, and digital rights sort of media and communications. And in a sense, they've kind of become developed in parallel rather than seeing how these each could help each other to, you know, really give the end user, you know, the individual, more agency and sense of kind of purpose and belonging and criticality online. So, yeah, we've got a few suggestions about how to move forward, but it was really a sort of think piece.
I think it was very interesting of this paper, Lucy, that you talk about these things as a complementary, that we don't have to work them in parallel. So it all talks about the other one. And this discussion you have about the difference between digital rights as something public and collective. I didn't read that much papers in that line, and I think that gave us, the citizens, some answers that we were not having. Let's say 1 month ago, I was reading a note about a researcher that talks about the right of privacy, that when you think it as the right of privacy as something individual, we can't do that much against the big tech companies or against the state. But if you think it about something public and collective, it changes a lot the agency or the possibility to fight for that rights. So maybe if you have some lines or insights, as you said that you have with Julian, some ideas of how to continue working on these ideas, it would be great to know it.
Yeah, I think the thing that sort of came to me whilst writing this as well was that with digital, we tend to really individualize and personalize. It's a very personalized experience, and so. And I'm sure it's the same with adults, but when working with young people, they really like just talking about what happened, what's going on online. And it brings that sense of collectivity. Oh, you've experienced that, so have I. And, what did you do about it? That sense of sharing. Young people is really helpful, and providing space and time for them to actually talk with each other and prioritizing that as a way forward. And then I guess you've got your kind of different constructs, whether it's literacies, citizenship or rights, to kind of bring to the table to kind of progress from. But I mean, to me, it's really starting to talk about the digital and to kind of break it down, because I mean, it is a wonderful, devices really are personal, so they're not even just the kind of very material nature of a computer or a mobile phone. It's your thing. And I think that kind of sets up the way people think about their experiences, even though they're shared the world over now. We all have very similar kinds of experiences. So to me, that kind of talking and the dialogical kind of element is really important to it. And then perhaps beginning to kind of bring those constructs to the table. Literacies first, maybe, and then citizenship rights. I don't know. But yeah, it's about provoking and finding that motivation to do something about these issues.
Last question for me. I don't know if maybe you are familiar with this perspective, but different colonial authors say that the critical perspective on the use of the data is possible only in society with high level of development, because in developing society, the priority is to supply initially digital technology to the population, we know that you know the rally, for example, in countries like Uruguay, Argentina, maybe the situation in these two countries is different, but from your point of view, is it possible to develop a critical perspective on the use of the data in this kind of society with a perspective of in a scenario of developing society, not consolidate the developing society.
So developing the critical skills. I think. I mean, look, we've seen, I think, in schools, for example, there's a lot of critical use of data, and the Data Smart Schools project I'm on, working with Neil, we've recently sort of found that teachers are very skeptical about the use of digital data, mainly because they rely on their own kind of tried and true methods of understanding their students and their performance. So I think there's a healthy skepticism really when it comes to data that's imported from somewhere else. But I think data can certainly be used very positively. You know, like, I mean, you only need to think about how it's helped with administrative things in schools. It's certainly made things more efficient, you know, that were, I guess, done manually. Digital data certainly accelerates and makes that more efficient. It can also, of course, highlight areas where students do need help. But I think the thing that I've found is that the most important thing with data is that it's local, you know, and it's generated locally, it's processed locally, and then applied locally. And they're the most effective uses of data that I've seen in action in schools and probably in society, really. Data in itself is not really the problem. It is, of course, what people do with it that makes it problematic. So we have, you know, standardized tests here in Australia, and many teachers, you know, really don't take that on board. I mean, I'm speaking very generally here, but they are aware of the problems associated with standardized testing, but they are more inclined to trust data that they've collected themselves on their own students, and they know what it means. They're able to interpret it. So I think data can be really excellent, obviously, in many ways, but it depends on it being used in that local way.
Luci,
does that answer your question?
Yeah, I get it. Yeah, totally. I want to ask you the last question, and it's an obligation for me. I was reading last week that you make a research in Argentina, in my country, and I wanted to ask you some mini highlight of the work you have been doing with Alejo Gonzalez about the curriculum, the EdTech curriculum of Argentina. So if you want to tell us some ideas you have been finding in that research, just to end the talk.
Well, that article's in Spanish, so I contributed some sections to it, and Alejo really is the expert on the Argentinian curriculum. So we were just, you know, he was just critiquing the curriculum there and how it hadn't kind of focused on a lot of the stuff we've been talking about tonight or this morning, to do with, you know, really, I guess, understandings or developing student understandings that can be applied in their everyday life, as opposed to just them being kind of knowledge workers in the economy. So the idea, I guess, is that we need to think more holistically about what digital education or digital learning means in schools. And I think the case is that in Argentina, you're probably better placed to answer this, or is that it has been more focused on, you know, jobs and outcomes and production, rather than you know, creating kind of critical and creative uses of digital stuff. So yeah, it was good fun. He's great, and it was good to apply some of the kind of tools that I've been using to a different context as well.
Wonderful.
For the end, please tell us some interesting idea about your blog, Materialism Data. You know, when I am sharing in the screen this blog. So what is the initial of this project? What is the most important thing that you think that we need to read in this point? Everything.
Oh, look, I'm at the moment, I'm just like reading a lot and writing about it. So I don't think there's anything that really is more important than another. I've certainly started to find some really interesting things. Like one thing that I've found, because this is that project I was talking about before, where I'm trying to work out ways to materialize data differently as a text for analysis. And one of the things that I found in my preliminary work is that a lot of the apps that are used, the parental like screen time control apps, I think I've got a post on it somewhere. the most common ones are actually using their privacy is just appalling, and it wouldn't actually, because a lot of them are based in the US, and they wouldn't actually meet the COPPA, the legal obligations for the US. So it's this kind of very interesting situation in which, you know, these companies are supposedly helping parents to manage their kids' screen time and social media use, but then they're actually really impinging on these people's privacy. So I found a few really interesting little things like that. But yeah, I'm interested in language, and I'm interested in visualization, and maybe sort of thinking critically about what visualization actually means, and how, you know, we can kind of, I guess, make it really work for us and develop people's understandings of data. So yeah, this is the FriendSend app that I was telling you about before. So we had a bit of we got a bit of media coverage on that, which was great. The kids enjoyed it. So yeah, I don't know. Hopefully there's something there that might interest you.
Luci, we want to thank you very much for your time and for sharing your knowledge. I was thinking, you know, the work of Juliana Gafagelli, that it's here in Barcelona as we, because yes, she's studying a lot that subjects and ideas, and it would be great to see how you could complement and all that stuff. So thank you very much. It was a very big pleasure to meet you in my case, and Pablo, to see you again. So thank you, and well, hope we could meet each other personally in some time.
That would be great.
In Barcelona, Luci.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been great to chat, and I would love to come to Barcelona. I've never been to Spain before, so one day.
As soon as possible.
Bye-bye.
Great.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks. Bye.